on and tell you a little bit about Travelujah, I want to give you a background because it's kind of important to understand the background in order to understand the concept and the website that we developed. So just a little bit of background. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, and I went to a public school in Royal Oak, which I'm not sure if many of you know this, but it was the home of the Shrine of the Flower, Little Flower, and there was a pastor there by the name of Father Coughlin back in the 1930s. I see some of you shaking your heads. He was a very, verdant anti-Semite and had a very popular radio show, and he was a Nazi sympathizer. This was kind of the community that I grew up in, and I was actually the only Jewish child in my kindergarten class. Kids used to ask me a lot of questions about my religion, my background. They saw that I was different from them. I would oftentimes be asked questions. I'd have to explain my traditions, the holidays, explain why I used to have to miss school for holidays. And there were lots of little anti-Semitic comments that I used to get when I would come home from school, whether somebody asked me if I had horns or chased home or what have you. And clearly there was an apparent lack of understanding and somewhat of ignorance in the community that I grew up in. I knew what Christmas was, and I knew what Easter was, but nobody seemed to understand my traditions. One time in kindergarten, before the spring holidays, the teachers let us bring in hard-boiled eggs to decorate them for Easter. And I was obviously this 5-year-old child. I was very excited about this. And actually my parents, who were very involved in the Jewish community there, were conservative Jews, also had no issue with my participation in such a project. And I brought mine to school, and I diligently painted the eggs and what have you, and meticulously worked on them. And later on the way home from school, with the eggs in a little basket, a little girl came up to me, an older girl, and she said, why are you carrying those home? What do you need those for? Aren't you Jewish? And I said, well, yeah. So she took them, smashed them, and I was so proud, and I went home, and I was obviously cried, and I was very upset. And this little girl was a Jew. And both of these stories left a really strong, indelible mark on me. On one hand, I saw two religions that were both laden with an equal lack of understanding about the other. And I, as a child, just did not get the dramatic differences. I mean, we were all people. And perhaps I was naive, but I always felt growing up that there had to be a way, that there was a way to achieve a better understanding between the faiths. So fast forward 30 plus years, approximately 5 years ago, I moved here with my husband, Yuval, and our 4 children, who at the time were between the ages of 4 and 13. And I didn't know at the time what the future held, but I knew that Israel presented to them something that our beautiful home in Boca Raton, Florida at that time would never offer them in their life, and that was ties to their Jewish roots and a sense of purpose about living in a place that was actually their homeland. And they're just, being in Israel, they would have that connection to the country, and they would actually grow up in a way of supporting Israel and knowing about their heritage and actually living their heritage. And for myself, I had to ask the question, how was I going to parlay 22 years of tourism consulting professionally, and somehow I'd have to figure that out. And as I know some of you, I had to pray over it and I had to really think about it. One of my favorite Hebrew words is beshert, and it's a word that you use when things kind of just happen. You say it was beshert, just like meeting Bill at the archaeological dig 3.5 years ago, or 3 years ago, it was beshert, and now today, 3 years later, here I am in front of one of his groups. One day I literally received a phone call from the local representative of the Holy See in Jerusalem, about a half a year after I moved here, asking me to perform a project on the Galilee and take a look at Christian tourism and pilgrimage, and to really understand what was going on there, because they wanted to do a large project. And certainly I was keenly aware that Israel was very important to 3 faiths, and yes, I knew it was the cradle of faith, and I knew it is God's country, and I certainly knew that from my own experience of being here, you do feel God's presence, as I'm sure all of you have felt at some point during the last several days on your tour. I am absolutely positive that every single person at some point here has felt God's presence. Raise your hand if you have felt God's presence. Okay. And I knew from my own experience that being here, that happens to me too. And it was obvious to me as a Jew that as an analyst, and that's basically what I was, looking at the tiny numbers and physically visiting all these important biblical heritage sites and reading and learning about the connection to these places from a Christian perspective, it was absolutely shocking to me that only 900,000 Christians at that time were coming to Israel annually. Actually, I think it was a little bit less because it was post the Second Intifada. But yet millions of Christians every single year go to Lourdes and go to other places, other pilgrimage destinations around the world. What was the problem? What's the problem? Security, cost, lack of understanding. You know, there had to be a way to get people connected to Israel. Because by getting people connected to Israel, by getting them to come to Israel, undoubtedly they will support Israel. And they will bless Israel. And possibly, if they get connected to Israel, they will one day come to Israel. But how is this going to happen? And I asked myself, what could I do to instill Christian support of Israel, to get Christians worldwide to connect with Israel? I knew that they're connected with the Bible, but how to get them connected with the Scriptures, but how to take that to the next step and get them here, and get them thinking about connecting to Israel. Well, why are people coming here? If you looked at the information and saw why are they coming here, the single most influential reason that people come to Israel is because somebody told them about it. It's not because of an ad. It's not because of a promotion. It's not because they got some sort of, $100 off. It's because somebody gave them a personal testimony about how important it was, how coming here was a transformative experience for them and changed their life. And so from that, I conceived of Travelujah. Travelujah was a home. It's like a website, a virtual home where people can come together. Israel offers what no other country in the world can offer, and that's an opportunity to experience the miracle of Israel, to touch the ancient and understand the modern, and to feel God's presence. And when you come here, those years of Bible study, the 40 years, the 30 years, the 50 years, that 1 week it comes alive with meaning. So what I ask you here today is that we want you to tell people that Israel is safe. We want you to go back and talk to people about your experience. Whether you like it or not, you are all ambassadors, and you have a new role. You actually have a moral imperative to go back. You represent a tiny, itsy-bitsy little minority of Christians worldwide who have ever been to Israel. And in our best year, we've had maybe 2 million people here. In our worst year, we've had a couple 100,000. And now that you've been here, to go back and let other people know, that's the most important thing. And the question is, how are you going to do that? And this is what I want to tell you. Go back and to join our website. Many of you, I bet, have written travel diaries. How many of you have written down things, okay? And how many of you are planning on writing about it when you get back? Okay. We want you to take those travel diaries, go home, join Travelujah. What we are is the repository of all those experiences, because by documenting those experiences, it becomes part of history. And by documenting those experiences, instead of just talking about it, people from around the world can come to the site and read about it. And read from you, who said it was so safe, or from, who was I speaking to, Bob, who said when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, that God spoke to him right there. Write it down. Let somebody who's sitting there in the middle of Finland go ahead and read that. Because that may motivate them to connect to Israel, to read more from experts, and to maybe one day come here and be a supporter. So I'm asking you to go back and take those travel diaries, copy them, join the site, put them in there. We'll promote it. We'll put it all over. We'll get people to read it. We're a site with a repository of all these experiences from people just like you. And they all get kind of like a Wikipedia. And it all gets tagged and all gets tracked, and it gets larger and bigger and more content, so that Christians have one home in which they can go and learn about the Holy Land and bless Israel. They can go home. It's not just coming here that you're blessing Israel, but it's going home and talking about it and writing it down. And that's what we're about. So I want to thank you for coming here, for becoming the newest ambassadors, and for going back and hopefully letting other people know how great it is.